The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable carefully crafted to wound. "We only pretend to care. You're just our charity case." My cousin Rachel's voice carried across the bustling family reunion with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut deep and leave permanent scars. I stood there, frozen in the middle of my grandmother's backyard, holding a paper plate of potato salad that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The laughter and chatter of 43 family members continued around me, but everything had gone silent in my world. The familiar sounds of children playing, adults catching up, and the distant sizzle of hamburgers on the grill all faded into a muffled background noise, as if someone had pressed the mute button on my entire existence. When family secrets exploded at our annual reunion that warm July afternoon, Rachel's cruel words shattered every illusion I had about belonging. Sometimes the people closest to you deliver the most devastating truths, and in that moment, I realized that the foundation I had built my entire sense of family identity upon was nothing more than quicksand. The Peterson family reunion had been a sacred tradition for over 20 years. Every summer, without fail, we would gather at Grandma Rose's sprawling property in rural Ohio. Her 5-acre lot, complete with ancient oak trees, a weathered red barn, and enough space for multiple generations to spread out comfortably, had become our unofficial headquarters for maintaining family bonds. I had looked forward to this day for months. As someone who had always felt like I was walking a tightrope between acceptance and rejection within my own family, these annual gatherings represented hope. They were my chance to prove that I belonged, that I was more than just an obligation or burden that everyone had to endure. But Rachel's words had just pulled the rug out from under everything I believed about my place in this family. And the worst part, the way she said it with such casual cruelty, as if she was commenting on the weather rather than destroying someone's entire sense of self-worth. How do you recover from learning that your entire family dynamic has been built on a lie? That every smile, every invitation, every moment of apparent acceptance was nothing more than elaborate theater designed to make themselves feel better about their Christian charity? To understand the devastating impact of Rachel's words, you need to understand the complicated history that brought me to that moment. My story within the Peterson family began before I was even born, rooted in circumstances that would forever mark me as different, as other, as the one who didn't quite fit. My mother, Linda, was the black sheep of the Peterson family long before I came along. While her 4 siblings followed predictable paths of marriage, mortgages, and suburban respectability, Linda had always marched to the beat of her own drum. She was the artistic one, the dreamer, the one who moved to the big city to pursue her passion for photography instead of settling down with a nice local boy like everyone expected. The family tolerated Linda's unconventional choices with the kind of strained patience usually reserved for relatives who drink too much at Christmas dinner. They would smile tightly and ask polite questions about her latest art project or freelance assignment, but there was always an undercurrent of disappointment, a sense that she was wasting her potential and embarrassing the family name. Everything changed when I was born. My father was never in the picture. To this day, I don't know if my mother doesn't know who he is, or if she knows and simply chose never to tell anyone, including me. What I do know is that my arrival as an unplanned, unmarried pregnancy in a conservative family was about as welcome as a tornado at a picnic. I was born when my mother was 24, still struggling to establish herself as a professional photographer in Chicago. The pregnancy was a complete surprise, and Linda's decision to keep me despite her precarious financial situation and lack of support system became the subject of many hushed family discussions that would define the next 2 decades of our lives. The Peterson family response was swift and predictable. They closed ranks around their image of respectability while simultaneously extending what they considered to be charitable support. Linda and I were welcomed back to the fold, but always with strings attached, always with the subtle reminder that we were recipients of their generosity rather than equal members of the family. We moved back to Ohio when I was 2 years old. Linda couldn't make it work as a single mother in the expensive city, and the family offered her a lifeline. Uncle Mark, who owned a small chain of hardware stores, gave her a job managing inventory and bookkeeping. Grandma Rose let us move into the small apartment above her detached garage rent-free. Aunt Susan helped with babysitting when needed. On the surface, it looked like a beautiful example of family support during difficult times. The Petersons could point to their assistance and feel good about their Christian values and family loyalty. But underneath that veneer of generosity was a complex web of guilt, obligation, and conditional acceptance that would shape every interaction I had with these people for the rest of my life. I grew up understanding, without anyone ever explicitly stating it, that I was different. I was the mistake that the family had rallied to help with, the burden they had collectively shouldered out of duty rather than love. Every kindness came with the invisible price tag of gratitude. Every inclusion in family activities carried the unspoken understanding that I should be thankful for being allowed to participate. Do you know what it's like to grow up feeling like you're constantly auditioning for a role in your own family? To understand from a young age that your acceptance is conditional, that you must always be grateful, always be on your best behavior, always be worthy of the charity being extended to you? The annual family reunion became the ultimate test of my worthiness. It was where I could see all the family dynamics play out in real time, where the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules became most apparent. And it was where I worked hardest to prove that I deserved my place at the table. The Peterson family operated on a complex, social hierarchy that was never officially acknowledged but was absolutely real and strictly enforced. At the top were the golden children, the ones who had made the family proud through their achievements, their adherence to traditional values, and their ability to enhance the family's reputation. Rachel occupied the highest tier of this hierarchy. She was Uncle Robert's oldest daughter, 2 years younger than me, but light years ahead in family standing. Rachel had everything the Peterson family valued. She was married to a successful accountant, lived in a beautiful suburban home, had 2 well-behaved children, and volunteered at her church. She was the poster child for Peterson family values, the one everyone pointed to as an example of how things should be done. But Rachel's elevated status came with a dark side that few people saw. Her position at the top of the family hierarchy had made her incredibly protective of that status, and she viewed anyone who might threaten her standing as a potential enemy. And in her mind, I represented the biggest threat of all. Think about it from Rachel's perspective. Here she was, doing everything right according to family standards, and yet I was the one who got the most attention at family gatherings. Not because I was more successful or more accomplished, but because my very presence was a reminder of the family's charity and goodness. I was their pet project, their living testament to their Christian values. Rachel resented this deeply. She had worked hard to earn her place in the family hierarchy through achievement and conformity, while I seemed to get attention simply by existing as the family's charity case. In her mind, I was stealing focus from her legitimate accomplishments with my constant need for support and inclusion. This resentment had been building for years, manifesting in subtle ways that only I seemed to notice. Rachel would make little comments about how lucky I was to have such a supportive family, how grateful I must be for all the help I received, how important it was for me to make the most of the opportunities one had been given. On the surface, these comments seemed supportive, even encouraging. But there was always an edge to them, a reminder that my place in the family was dependent on their continued charity. Rachel had mastered the art of the backhanded compliment, the cutting remark disguised as concern. Other family members fell somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy, their standing determined by factors like career success, marriage stability, number of children, church attendance, and adherence to family expectations. My cousins Mike and Jennifer were solid middle-tier family members, respected but not revered. Aunt Susan's son David struggled with substance abuse issues, which dropped him near the bottom of the hierarchy, though his problems were discussed with sympathy rather than the subtle condescension reserved for me. And then there was me, occupying a unique position at the very bottom of the hierarchy. I wasn't just unsuccessful or problematic like Cousin David. I was something worse in the Peterson family ecosystem. I was a reminder of their obligation to be charitable, their burden to bear, their good deed that they could never stop doing. The annual reunion was where this hierarchy became most visible. Seating arrangements at dinner, who got asked to help with important tasks, whose achievements were celebrated most enthusiastically, whose opinions were sought on family decisions. All of these things reflected the invisible but very real social order that governed Peterson family dynamics. I had learned to navigate the system carefully over the years. I knew to express appropriate gratitude for any kindness shown to me. I knew to volunteer for cleanup duties without being asked. I knew to deflect attention from my own modest accomplishments and instead praise others for their successes. I knew to make myself useful without being too prominent, helpful without being presumptuous. It was exhausting, this constant performance of worthiness. But I thought it was working. I thought I had found a sustainable way to maintain my place in the family through careful management of my behavior and expectations. I had no idea that behind the scenes, family members like Rachel were growing increasingly tired of the performance. They were ready to drop the pretense of charity and tell me exactly what they really thought of my place in their lives. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you understood the rules of the game, only to discover that everyone else was playing by a completely different set of rules? That's exactly what was about to happen to me at Grandma Rose's house on that July afternoon. The morning of the reunion started like every other year. I woke up early in the small apartment above Grandma Rose's garage, the same space where my mother and I had lived for most of my childhood. At 26, I still lived there, partly for financial reasons and partly because it had become comfortable and familiar. The arrangement worked for everyone involved. I helped Grandma with household tasks and yard work, and she provided affordable housing that allowed me to save money while working as a graphic designer for a small local marketing firm. I could hear the sounds of preparation beginning in the main house as I got ready for the day. Grandma Rose was an early riser, and I knew she had probably been up since 5 in the morning, preparing dishes and making sure everything was perfect for the family gathering. This reunion was her proudest moment of the year, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. The theme for this year's reunion was celebrating our legacy, and Grandma had asked everyone to bring photos and memorabilia that represented important family moments. I had spent weeks putting together a photo collage that highlighted the past 20 years of Peterson family reunions, carefully selecting images that showed me integrated into family activities and celebrations. Looking back, I realize how desperate that collage was, how it represented my ongoing effort to prove my belonging through documentation. See, the photo seemed to say I was there too. I was part of these moments. I belong in this family history. By 10 o'clock in the morning, family members were beginning to arrive. The reunion officially started at noon, but people always came early to help with setup and catch up with relatives they hadn't seen since the previous year. The backyard began filling up with folding tables, coolers full of drinks, and the various dishes that everyone contributed to the potluck meal. I threw myself into the preparation work with my usual enthusiasm. I helped Uncle Mark set up the volleyball net. I arranged chairs around the various seating areas. I helped Aunt Susan organize the dessert table. I made sure the kids had everything they needed for their games and activities. This was my comfort zone, the space where I felt most secure in my family role. As long as I was being useful, as long as I was contributing to the success of the gathering, I felt like I had a legitimate reason to be there. Physical labor was my way of earning my place at the table, quite literally. Rachel arrived around 11:30 with her husband Tom and their 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jake. She looked perfect, as always, wearing a carefully coordinated outfit that managed to be both casual and elegant. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup was flawless, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who never doubted their place in any social situation. I watched her make her rounds through the gathering, greeting family members with the easy familiarity of someone who had never had to question their welcome. She hugged Grandma Rose with genuine warmth, chatted easily with the uncles about their businesses, and seamlessly joined conversations without any of the social anxiety that I always felt at these gatherings. The contrast between Rachel's natural ease and my careful performance was stark, and I found myself studying her interactions with a mixture of admiration and envy. This was what it looked like to belong somewhere without reservation, to take your place in a family for granted rather than constantly working to maintain it. The meal preparation reached its peak around noon as everyone contributed their dishes to the elaborate spread that had become a Peterson family tradition. There were at least 15 different salads, 8 casseroles, 3 types of baked beans, fresh corn on the cob, grilled hamburgers and hot dogs, and enough desserts to feed twice as many people as were actually present. I had contributed my grandmother's famous 7-layer salad, the recipe she had taught me when I was 12 years old. It was one of the few family traditions that I felt genuinely connected to, a skill that had been passed down to me with the same love and attention given to any other grandchild. As we gathered around the various tables for the meal, I felt a familiar sense of optimism about the day ahead. The food was delicious, the weather was perfect, and everyone seemed to be in good spirits. Several people complimented my salad, and I basked in the rare experience of being praised for something I had contributed to the family gathering. After the meal, we moved into the traditional post-lunch activities. The kids played games while the adults caught up on the year's events. Photo albums were passed around, updating everyone on graduations, promotions, new babies, and other family milestones. This was always my favorite part of the reunion, the time when we connected as a family and celebrated each other's achievements. But this year, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite identify, a sense that conversations were happening at multiple levels simultaneously. People would make eye contact with each other across the yard in a way that suggested shared knowledge or inside jokes. There were whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, and moments of awkward silence that hadn't been present in previous years. I tried to dismiss these observations as paranoia, the result of my own insecurities rather than any real change in family dynamics. After all, I was always hyper-aware of my social position at these gatherings, always looking for signs of acceptance or rejection. Maybe I was just reading too much into normal family interactions. But as the afternoon wore on, the strange atmosphere became harder to ignore. And then, around 3 o'clock, everything came crashing down in a conversation that would change my understanding of my place in this family forever. The catalyst was something so simple, so innocent, that it makes the resulting devastation even more shocking. I was standing near the dessert table, helping myself to a slice of Aunt Susan's famous chocolate cake, when I overheard Rachel talking to our cousin Jennifer about summer vacation plans. "We're thinking about renting a house in the Outer Banks for a week in August," Rachel was saying. "The whole extended family could come. It would be like a mini reunion at the beach." "That sounds amazing," Jennifer replied. "Who would you invite?" Rachel began listing family members who would be included in this beach vacation, and I found myself listening with growing excitement. A week at the beach with the family sounded like the perfect opportunity to strengthen my relationships with everyone, to create new memories and deepen the bonds that I was always working to build. Without thinking, I stepped into the conversation. "That sounds wonderful, Rachel. I'd love to help with the planning if you need someone to coordinate activities or handle logistics." The silence that followed my offer was deafening. Both Rachel and Jennifer stared at me with expressions that I couldn't quite read, a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like pity. The conversation around us seemed to pause as other family members tuned in to what was happening. Rachel's response, when it finally came, was delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, well, we'll see how the numbers work out. Beach houses are expensive, and we need to keep the group to immediate family members only." "I understand completely," I said quickly, trying to backtrack from what was obviously an unwelcome intrusion into their planning. "I just thought I'd offer to help if needed." But Rachel wasn't finished. Something in my eagerness to be included, something in my automatic assumption that I would be part of any family vacation, had triggered a response that had probably been building for years. She looked directly at me with her expression that was colder than anything I had ever seen from a family member. And then she said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "You know what, Sarah? We only pretend to care. You're just our charity case. Did you really think you'd be invited to a family vacation? You're lucky we even include you in these reunions." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, poisoning everything around them. I felt the blood drain from my face as the full impact of what she had just said settled into my consciousness. Every conversation around us had stopped. Every eye in the immediate area was focused on our interaction. The only sound was the distant laughter of children playing, blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding nearby. But Rachel wasn't done destroying my world. "I mean, let's be honest here," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was finally telling a truth that had been hidden too long. "We all do our Christian duty by including you, but don't mistake obligation for genuine affection. You're not really family, you're a project. And frankly, some of us are getting tired of pretending otherwise. Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire understanding of reality shifts so dramatically that you feel like you're falling through space? That's what happened to me in that backyard, surrounded by the people I had spent my entire life trying to please and belong with. 24 years of careful performance, of gratitude, of making myself useful and worthy, it had all been based on a lie. Not the lie that they loved me, because I had never fully believed that, but the lie that my performance was working, that I was successfully earning my place in their lives through my behavior and contributions. The truth was so much worse than I had ever imagined. They weren't just tolerating me out of obligation, they were actively resenting the burden of that obligation. And now, in front of half the family, Rachel had finally said what they had all been thinking for years. I was their charity case, their Christian duty, their burden to bear. And they were tired of carrying it. The moments immediately following Rachel's devastating revelation felt like they lasted for hours, though I'm sure only seconds passed in real time. I stood there, still holding my paper plate with its untouched slice of chocolate cake, as her words echoed in my mind and the full weight of their meaning began to settle over me like a suffocating blanket. The faces around me became a blur of expressions that I couldn't quite process, some shocked, some uncomfortable, some that looked almost relieved that someone had finally said what they had all been thinking. But no one, not a single person in that circle of family members, rushed to my defense or contradicted Rachel's brutal assessment of my place in their lives. That silence was almost more devastating than her original words, because it confirmed that Rachel hadn't spoken out of momentary cruelty or personal frustration. She had given voice to a family consensus that had apparently existed for years without my knowledge. My mother appeared at my elbow as if materializing from thin air, her face pale with horror at what she had just witnessed. "Sarah, honey," she whispered, taking the plate from my trembling hands. "Let's go inside for a minute." But I couldn't move. I was rooted to that spot by a mixture of shock, humiliation, and a desperate need to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. If Rachel felt comfortable making these statements publicly, in front of multiple family members, what had they been saying about me in private conversations over the years? Is that really how everyone feels? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet backyard. Am I really just a charity case to all of you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring someone, anyone, to contradict Rachel's assessment. I looked around at the faces of people I had known my entire life, searching for someone who would speak up on my behalf, someone who would tell me that Rachel was wrong, that she was speaking only for herself. Uncle Mark cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Rachel, that's not how we talk about family," he said, but his tone was more about maintaining social decorum than defending me personally. "We're all family here." "Are we, though?" Rachel shot back, emboldened by the fact that no one had actually contradicted her core message. "I mean, really, are we? Because family doesn't usually require this much management." Management. The word hit me like another physical blow. Is that what my entire existence had been to them? A management problem that they had been collectively dealing with for 2 decades. My cousin Jennifer, who had been part of the original conversation about the beach vacation, finally spoke up. But instead of defending me, she seemed to be trying to soften Rachel's message without actually contradicting it. "I think what Rachel means," Jennifer said carefully, "is that we all have different relationships within the family. Some are closer, some are more supportive. That's natural in any large family. Supportive. Another euphemism designed to avoid saying what they all apparently believed, that I was a recipient of their charity rather than a genuine family member. Grandma Rose, who had been standing near the house when the confrontation began, made her way over to our group with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who was trying to decide how to handle a crisis. At 82 years old, she was still the undisputed matriarch of the Peterson family, and her opinion carried more weight than anyone else's. "That's enough," she said firmly, but I couldn't tell if she was addressing Rachel's cruelty or my presence at the reunion. This is not the time or place for this kind of discussion. But I needed to know. After 24 years of carefully managing my behavior to maintain my place in this family, I needed to understand exactly where I stood with all of them. "Grandma," I said, turning to face the woman who had raised me as much as my own mother had, "is Rachel right? Am I just a charity case to this family?" The pause before she answered told me everything I needed to know, but I waited for her words anyway. "Sweetheart," she said, using the same gentle tone she had always used when delivering difficult truths, "we love you and your mother. You're both important to this family." But it's also true that our relationship has always been different because of the circumstances. Different because of the circumstances. Even Grandma Rose couldn't bring herself to say that I was genuinely loved and accepted as an equal member of his family. The best she could offer was that I was important because of their obligation to help with the circumstances of my birth and childhood. The full scope of my self-deception became crystal clear in that moment. I had spent my entire life interpreting their sense of duty and obligation as love. I had mistaken their Christian charity for genuine affection. I had built my entire identity around belonging to a family that had never actually accepted me as anything more than a responsibility. Do you know what it feels like to discover that your entire life has been built on a fundamental misunderstanding? That every relationship you valued, every moment of apparent acceptance, every gesture of kindness was actually something completely different than what you believed it to be. My legs finally started working again, and I took a step backward from the group that had just shattered my world. Then another step, and another, until I was backing away from not just the conversation, but from the entire gathering, from the backyard where I had spent so many happy moments, from the family that had just revealed their true feelings about my existence. "I think I need to go," I said, though I'm not sure anyone actually heard me over the murmur of conversations that were starting to resume around us. The other family members were beginning to disperse, clearly uncomfortable with the scene they had just witnessed and eager to return to the normal pleasantries of the reunion. But as I turned to walk toward the house, Rachel called after me with one final observation that completed the destruction of everything I had believed about my place in the Peterson family. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like satisfaction, "maybe this is actually a good thing. Maybe it's time we all stopped pretending and started being honest about what this relationship really is." I kept walking, but her words followed me with devastating clarity. Because she was right about one thing, we had all been pretending. But while I had been pretending that I was earning genuine love and acceptance through my behavior, they had been pretending that their sense of Christian duty was the same thing as family affection. And now that the pretending was over, I had to figure out what came next. The walk from Grandma Rose's backyard to the apartment above her garage was less than 100 yards, but it felt like the longest journey of my life. Every step carried me further away from the family gathering that continued behind me and deeper into a new reality that I wasn't prepared to face. I could hear the sounds of the reunion resuming as I walked away, conversations picking up, children laughing, the clink of silverware against plates as people returned to their desserts. Life was going on as if nothing had happened, as if my entire world hadn't just been turned upside down by a few sentences delivered with surgical precision. The worst part was how easily they were all moving on from what had just occurred. For me, Rachel's words represented a complete upheaval of everything I believed about my place in the world. But for them, it seemed like nothing more than an awkward moment that was better forgotten than addressed. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment with shaking hands, fumbling with the key as I tried to unlock the door. Once inside, I collapsed onto my small couch and stared at the photo collage I had so carefully prepared for the reunion. All those images of family gatherings, carefully selected to show my integration into Peterson family life, now looked like evidence of my own delusion. There I was at Christmas morning 2019, smiling as I helped hand out presents. There I was at Cousin Mike's wedding in 2021, dancing with Uncle Mark. There I was at last year's reunion, laughing at something Aunt Susan had said. In every photo, I looked happy and included, completely unaware that I was documenting my participation in an elaborate charade. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. "Coming up to check on you in a few minutes," it read. "Give me a chance to extract myself from the situation down there." I appreciated her concern, but I also dreaded the conversation we were about to have. Because if I had been fooling myself about my place in this family, what did that say about her position? Had she known the truth all along and chosen not to share it with me? Or had she been living with the same delusions that had just been so brutally shattered? While I waited for her arrival, I found myself replaying not just Rachel's words, but years of interactions that suddenly took on new meaning in light of this revelation. The carefully worded invitations to family events that emphasized how much they hoped I could make it, as if my attendance was never assumed. The way conversations would pause when I joined them, requiring a moment of adjustment before continuing. The subtle emphasis on my gratitude whenever I contributed to family gatherings or received help with anything. It had all been there, hadn't it? The signs that I wasn't quite on the same level as everyone else, that my participation in family life required special consideration rather than automatic inclusion. I had chosen to interpret these signals as evidence of their care and concern for me, when in reality, they were indicators of the extra effort required to manage my presence in their lives. There was a soft knock on my door, and I opened it to find my mother standing there with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of profound sadness. She had clearly used the time it took to prepare the coffee to process what had just happened and determine how to approach the conversation we needed to have. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said as she handed me one of the cups and settled into the chair across from my couch. "I never thought Rachel would be that cruel, especially not in front of everyone." "But she was right, wasn't she?" I asked, not really wanting to hear the answer but needing to understand the full truth. "I mean, about us being charity cases. About them only pretending to care." My mother sighed deeply and stared into her coffee for a long moment before responding. "It's complicated, Sarah. When you were born, the family did step up to help us. And yes, some of that help came from a sense of duty rather than pure love. But that doesn't mean they don't care about you at all." "Mom," I said, setting down my coffee and looking directly at her, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know that this is how they felt? Have you been aware all along that we were their charity project?" The pause before her answer told me everything, but I waited for her words anyway. "I've always known that our relationship with the family was conditional," she admitted. "When I got pregnant with you, they made it clear that their support came with expectations. We were expected to be grateful. We were expected to not cause problems or make demands. We were expected to understand that their help was generous rather than obligatory. And you never told me this. What was I supposed to tell you?" she asked, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. "That your family only tolerated you? That every kindness came with strings attached? I wanted you to have a sense of belonging, even if it wasn't perfect. So you let me spend 24 years thinking I was earning their love through good behavior. I hoped that maybe, over time, the relationship would become more genuine. That you would prove yourself to them in a way that I never could." The sadness in her voice was heartbreaking, but it also revealed another layer of deception that I was only beginning to understand. My mother hadn't just allowed me to believe in my place in this family, she had encouraged it because it represented her own hope for acceptance and redemption. Every time she praised me for helping at family gatherings, every time she emphasized the importance of showing gratitude for the family support, every time she encouraged me to work harder to fit in, she had been trying to achieve through me what she had never been able to accomplish for herself. "Mom," I said gently, because I could see how painful this conversation was for her, "do you think there was ever a chance that we could have earned their genuine acceptance? Or were we always going to be the charity cases, no matter what we did?" She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, honey. I really don't know." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of what we had learned about our place in the Peterson family hierarchy. Outside, we could hear the reunion continuing, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting up from the backyard where our lives had just been fundamentally altered. "What do we do now?" I asked, voicing the question that was at the heart of everything we were facing. "I don't know that either," my mother replied. "But I think we need to figure out who we are when we're not performing for their approval anymore." It was a terrifying prospect, discovering our identities outside of the family dynamic that had defined both of our lives for so long. But as I sat there listening to the sounds of a family gathering that we were no longer part of, I realized that it might also be liberating. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about earning anyone's approval or proving my worthiness. The worst had already happened. They had told me exactly what they thought of me. There was nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by finally being honest about what I thought of them. But first, I had to figure out what that was. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, sort of suspended animation. My mother and I could hear the family reunion continuing below us, the sounds of children playing games, adults chatting and laughing, the general bustle of a large family gathering in full swing. But we remained in my small apartment, 2 floors above it all, like observers watching a play that we were no longer part of. Around 5 o'clock, there was another knock on my door. This time it was Grandma Rose, looking every one of her 82 years as she climbed the stairs with obvious effort. Her usually perfect silver hair was slightly disheveled, and her face showed the strain of managing the family crisis that had erupted at her annual reunion. "May I come in?" she asked, though she was already stepping through the doorway. Grandma Rose had never been one to wait for permission when she had something important to say. My mother immediately stood up. "I should give you two some privacy," she said, but Grandma Rose waved her back into her chair. "Linda, you should hear this too. This conversation affects both of you." She settled herself carefully into the remaining chair and looked at both of us with the expression of someone who had spent the past 2 hours thinking very carefully about what she needed to say. "First," she began, "I want to apologize for what happened this afternoon. Rachel was out of line, and her timing was particularly cruel. A family reunion is supposed to be a celebration, not an occasion for airing grievances." I waited for her to continue, but something in her tone suggested that this apology came with conditions. "However," she said, and there it was, "I think there are some things that need to be said, and perhaps it's better that we're having this conversation now rather than letting the situation continue as it has been." "What situation?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that I didn't want to hear the answer. "The situation where we all pretend that our family dynamics are normal and healthy, when they clearly aren't," Grandma Rose said with a kind of blunt honesty that had made her the family matriarch. "Sarah, you've spent your entire life trying to earn something that was never really available to you. And we've let you do it because it was easier than having this difficult conversation." The words hit me like a second wave of devastation, but this time they came wrapped in the gentle tone that I had always associated with love and acceptance. Somehow, that made them even more painful than Rachel's cruel directness. "What do you mean it was never really available to me?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Grandma Rose sighed deeply and looked out the window toward the backyard where her family was still gathered. "When your mother came home pregnant and unmarried, it created a problem for this family. Not just practically, but philosophically. We're conservative people, Sarah. We believe in traditional values, in doing things the right way. Your very existence was a reminder that those values had been violated." "But you helped us," my mother interjected. "You gave us a place to live, jobs, support." "Yes, we did," Grandma Rose agreed. "Because that's what Christian families do. We take care of our own, even when they make mistakes. But Linda, you have to understand that helping you is always seen as managing a crisis rather than welcoming you home." The clinical way she described our lives as a crisis to be managed was breathtaking in its coldness. This was the woman who had taught me to bake cookies, who had helped me with homework, who had hugged me when I was sad. And yet she was sitting here describing my entire existence as a problem that the family had nobly chosen to solve. "And me?" I asked. "What was I in all of this?" "You were an innocent child who deserved love and care," she said, and for a moment I thought she was going to offer me something genuine. "But you were also a constant reminder of the family's disappointment. Every time we looked at you, we were reminded of the choices that brought you into our lives. Have you ever had someone explain to you, in loving tones, why you could never truly belong somewhere? It's a unique kind of psychological torture, delivered with such care and concern that you almost feel grateful for finally understanding why you always felt like an outsider." "So all these years," I said slowly, "when I was trying so hard to prove my worth, to show that I belonged here, you all knew it was impossible?" "Not impossible," Grandma Rose corrected, "but conditional. Your place in this family was always going to be dependent on your behavior, your gratitude, your willingness to accept a secondary role. You could earn our affection, but you could never earn our unconditional acceptance." The distinction she was making was subtle but devastating. I had been auditioning for a role that had specific parameters, and no amount of good performance could change the fundamental nature of the part one had been cast to play. "Why didn't anyone ever tell me this?" I asked. "Why did you let me spend decades thinking I could change things?" "Because," my mother said quietly, speaking up for the first time since Grandma Rose had arrived, "we all hoped that maybe, eventually, the performance would become reality. That if you were good enough, helpful enough, grateful enough, they would forget about the circumstances of your birth and accept you as a real family member." But that was never going to happen, was it? I asked, looking directly at Grandma Rose. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. Probably not, sweetheart. I'm sorry, but probably not. The finality of her admission settled over the room like a heavy blanket. There it was, the truth that had been hidden behind decades of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and family reunions. I had been performing in a play where the ending was already written, and I was never going to be the protagonist. So what happens now? I asked. Do I just stop coming to family gatherings? Do we pretend this conversation never happened? What's the protocol for this situation? Grandma Rose looked genuinely uncertain for the first time since she had arrived. I don't know, she admitted. This isn't a situation I've ever had to navigate before. Well, maybe it's time we figured it out, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Because I'm not going back to pretending that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. And I'm not going to keep performing for acceptance that was never really available. What are you saying? My mother asked, and I could hear the worry in her voice. I'm saying that I'm done, I replied, the words feeling strange in my mouth but also surprisingly liberating. I'm done trying to earn something that was never on offer. I'm done being grateful for scraps of attention. I'm done making myself useful to justify my existence. The silence that followed my declaration was heavy with implications that we were all still trying to understand. Sarah, Grandma Rose said carefully, I hope you won't let your hurt feelings destroy relationships that, while imperfect, have still provided you with important support over the years. Hurt feelings? I repeated, incredulous. Grandma, I just learned that my entire life has been built on a lie. That every moment of apparent love and acceptance was actually something else entirely. These aren't hurt feelings. This is the complete collapse of my understanding of reality. She flinched at the intensity in my voice, but I wasn't finished. And you know what the most devastating part is? It's not that you don't love me the way I thought you did. It's that you all allowed me to exhaust myself for years trying to earn something you knew you weren't capable of giving. You watched me perform and struggle and worry and try so hard, and you never once told me that I was wasting my time. We didn't want to hurt you, my mother said quietly. But you did hurt me, I replied. You hurt me by letting me believe in a lie for 24 years. You hurt me by allowing me to build my entire identity around belonging somewhere that I was never truly welcome. And you hurt me by making me feel like a failure every time I sensed that something wasn't right, because I thought it meant I wasn't trying hard enough. The room fell silent again as the full weight of what we were discussing settled over all of us. Outside, I could hear cars starting up as family members began to leave the reunion. The annual Peterson family gathering was ending just like it did every year. But this time, I wouldn't be helping with cleanup or making plans for next year's event. Because for the first time in my life, I finally understood the rules of the game we had all been playing. And now that I understood them, I realized I didn't want to play anymore. The conversation with Grandma Rose lasted another hour, but it felt like we were all just dancing around the central truth that had already been established. I had never really belonged in the Peterson family, and everyone except me had known it. She tried, in her own way, to soften the blow by emphasizing the practical benefits I had received from being part of their extended support system. The housing, the job opportunities, the financial help during difficult times. These were real things, she pointed out, valuable things that had made my life better and easier. But what she couldn't seem to understand was that I would have preferred honest charity to false family. If they had simply said from the beginning, we're going to help Linda and her daughter because it's the right thing to do, but they're not really family members in the traditional sense, I could have built my identity around that truth rather than spending decades trying to transform their obligation into love. After she left, my mother and I sat in my small living room as the sun began to set, both of us trying to process what this revelation meant for our future. The sounds from the backyard had finally quieted as the last of the family members cleaned up and headed home, leaving us alone with the wreckage of everything we had believed about our place in the world. I keep thinking about all the times I pushed you to try harder, my mother said, breaking the silence. All the times I told you that if you just helped more, or were more grateful, or made yourself more useful, they would appreciate you more. I was basically coaching you to perform better in a show that was never going to have a happy ending. You didn't know, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Didn't I? She asked. I mean, maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe I convinced myself that their obligation could become genuine affection if we just played our parts well enough. But the signs were always there, weren't they? I thought about the countless subtle indicators that I had chosen to interpret as evidence of their care rather than their burden. The way invitations to family events were phrased as requests rather than assumptions. The emphasis on gratitude whenever I received help or support. The careful management of my presence at family gatherings to ensure I was useful but not too prominent. Yeah, I admitted. The signs were always there. We spent the evening going through photo albums and family memorabilia, looking at decades of Peterson family history with new eyes. What had once seemed like evidence of my inclusion now looked like documentation of my performance. Every smile, every gesture of helpfulness, every moment of apparent belonging took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of what I now knew to be true. The most painful part was realizing how exhausted I had been by the constant effort to maintain my place in their lives. I had spent so much energy trying to be the perfect, grateful recipient of their charity that I had never taken the time to figure out who I actually was or what I actually wanted. What kind of person was I when I wasn't trying to earn approval? What did I enjoy when I wasn't carefully managing my preferences to align with family expectations? What were my own values and opinions when they weren't filtered through the need to maintain my position as the grateful charity case? I had no idea. At 26 years old, I was about to meet myself for the first time. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about managing my relationship with the Peterson family because there was no relationship left to manage. Rachel's brutal honesty had freed me from the exhausting performance that had defined my entire existence. But freedom, I quickly discovered, was terrifying. My phone buzzed with text messages from various family members throughout the morning. Uncle Mark wanted to talk things through when emotions weren't running so high. Aunt Susan hoped I understood that Rachel didn't speak for everyone in the family. Cousin Jennifer suggested we all get together for coffee to clear the air about what had happened at the reunion. Each message followed the same pattern. They wanted to return to the status quo, to smooth over the uncomfortable truth that had been revealed, to go back to the comfortable pretense that we were all one big happy family with some minor communication issues to work through. But I wasn't interested in going back to performing for their comfort. I spent the morning drafting a response that I sent to the family group text chain, a digital space where I had always been careful to express appropriate gratitude for any kindness and enthusiasm for any family activity. Thank you all for your messages, I wrote. I've had time to think about what happened yesterday, and I've realized that Rachel was right about our family dynamic. I have been a charity case, and you've all been managing that charity for over 20 years. There's nothing wrong with that arrangement in principle, but I'm no longer interested in participating in it. I won't be attending future family gatherings, and I prefer that we transition to a more honest relationship based on what this has always actually been rather than what I thought it was. I wish you all well. Sending that message was simultaneously the most terrifying and most liberating thing I had ever done. For the first time in my life, I was being completely honest with the Peterson family about my feelings and intentions, without worrying about how my honesty would affect my standing with them. Because I no longer had any standing to protect. The responses came quickly and followed a predictable pattern. Shocked that I was overreacting to Rachel's moment of frustration. Disappointment that I was throwing away years of family relationships over a misunderstanding. Concern that I was making a decision based on hurt feelings rather than rational consideration of the situation. But buried in all the attempts to minimize what had happened, there was something else: relief. I could sense it in the careful wording of their messages, in what they didn't say as much as what they did. They were sorry that the truth had come out in such a cruel way, but they weren't sorry that it had come out. Because the performance had been exhausting for them too. Think about it from their perspective. For over 20 years, they had been managing the complex emotional and social dynamics of including someone in family life who wasn't quite family, someone who required special consideration and careful handling. They had been performing their own version of acceptance and inclusion, just as I had been performing gratitude and belonging. Rachel's brutal honesty had freed all of us from that performance, even if none of us had been prepared for what life would look like afterward. The weeks following the reunion were unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning without a mental checklist of how I needed to behave to maintain my relationships with the Peterson family. There were no upcoming family events to worry about, no phone calls to manage carefully, no social dynamics to navigate with strategic precision. It was disorienting and liberating in equal measure. I began to notice things about myself that had been obscured by years of careful performance. I actually enjoyed spending quiet evenings alone reading, something I had always felt guilty about because I thought I should be more social and outgoing to maintain my likability with family members. I preferred small, intimate gatherings to large family events, but I had never allowed myself to acknowledge this preference because it might be interpreted as ingratitude for being included in big celebrations. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I had opinions about things that differed significantly from Peterson family orthodoxy. I was more liberal politically than I had ever allowed myself to express. I was interested in travel and adventure in ways that the family would have considered impractical and selfish. I valued artistic expression and creativity over financial security and traditional success. These weren't new developments. They were parts of myself that had always existed but had been carefully suppressed in service of maintaining my acceptable persona within the family structure. My relationship with my mother also began to shift during this period. Without the shared project of managing our position within the Peterson family hierarchy, we had to discover what our relationship was based on when stripped of that external framework. It was challenging at first because so much of our interaction had revolved around strategizing about family dynamics and supporting each other through the complex emotions that came with our uncertain status. But gradually, we began to connect on different levels. We talked about books we were reading, places we wanted to travel, dreams we had never pursued because they didn't align with the image of grateful charity recipients that we had been maintaining. My mother revealed sides of herself that I had never seen. Her sense of humor was sharper and more irreverent than I had known, and her opinions were more independent and thoughtful than she had been able to express while managing her own performance for the family. "I feel like I'm getting to know my own daughter for the first time," she told me one evening as we sat on my small balcony watching the sunset. "And I'm getting to know myself again, too." The absence of the Peterson family from our lives left a void, but it wasn't the devastating emptiness that I had expected. Instead, it was more like the space left behind when you remove furniture that was never quite right for the room. Suddenly there was space to arrange things in a way that actually worked for the people who lived there. I began to build new relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than shared obligation. Coworkers who I had always kept at arm's length because I was so focused on family relationships became actual friends. I joined a hiking group and discovered that I love spending time outdoors, something I had never made time for because weekends were usually devoted to family activities or recovery from family activities. Most importantly, I started to understand what it felt like to be liked for who I actually was rather than who I was performing to be. The people in my hiking group knew nothing about my complicated family history or my status as anyone's charity case. They liked me because I was funny during difficult climbs, because I always brought good snacks to share, because I was reliable and encouraging when others were struggling. It was revolutionary to discover that I was actually likable when I wasn't trying so hard to be likable. But the most significant change was in my relationship with work and career ambitions. I had been working as a graphic designer for a small local marketing firm, a job that paid the bills but didn't particularly inspire me. I had stayed in the position partly because it was practical and stable, qualities that the Peterson family valued, and partly because I had never felt free to take risks that might require asking for their support if things went wrong. Now, without the need to maintain their approval or avoid becoming a burden, I began to consider possibilities that I had never allowed myself to explore. I had always been interested in freelance work and the possibility of starting my own design business, but it had seemed too risky and self-indulgent when I was supposed to be demonstrating stability and gratitude. 6 weeks after the reunion, I gave my boss notice and launched my own freelance graphic design practice. It was terrifying and exciting in ways that my previous, carefully managed life had never been. Some months were financially tight, but I was building something that belonged entirely to me, something that existed independently of anyone else's opinion about my worthiness or deserving. The Peterson family continued to exist in the background of my life, of course. I still lived above Grandma Rose's garage, though I was actively looking for my own apartment. I still saw them occasionally when they visited Grandma, or when our paths crossed in town. But these interactions were brief and polite rather than emotionally charged, the way you might interact with neighbors who you don't particularly like but need to coexist with peacefully. The strangest part was how little I missed the drama and complexity of managing those relationships. I had spent so many years thinking that family connection was essential to my well-being that I was surprised to discover how much energy had been consumed by maintaining those connections. Without that constant emotional labor, I had space and energy for other things that brought me genuine satisfaction and joy. But I was also learning that freedom from toxic family dynamics doesn't automatically solve all of life's challenges. I still had to figure out who I wanted to be and what I wanted to accomplish with my life. The difference was that now I was making those decisions based on my own values and interests rather than on what would be most likely to maintain my precarious position within someone else's family structure. It was harder in some ways because I couldn't blame my limitations or failures on the need to manage family relationships. But it was also infinitely more honest and, ultimately, more satisfying. 3 months after the reunion, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Other family members started reaching out to me individually, not to convince me to return to family gatherings, but to have honest conversations about their own experiences within the Peterson family hierarchy. The first was my cousin David, Uncle Mark's youngest son, who had struggled with substance abuse issues throughout his 20s. He called me on a Tuesday evening in October, and after some initial awkward small talk, he got to the point of why he had contacted me. "I wanted you to know that what Rachel said to you at the reunion wasn't just about you," he said. "I mean, it was cruel, and she shouldn't have said it that way, but the whole charity case thing, that's how they've always treated me too, just for different reasons." This was a revelation I hadn't expected. David had always seemed like a legitimate family member to me, despite his problems. He was a Peterson by birth, after all, with the same last name and bloodline that I lacked. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Think about it," he said. "Every time I got arrested or went to rehab or lost another job, they would all rally around to help me. But it was the same kind of help you got, conditional, temporary, designed to manage a problem rather than actually support a person. And I was expected to be grateful for their intervention and prove that I deserved their continued assistance." As he talked, I began to see the Peterson family dynamic from a completely different angle. It wasn't just about my illegitimate birth or my mother's unmarried status. It was about a family system that operated on hierarchy and conditional acceptance, where anyone who didn't meet the standards of success and respectability became a management problem rather than a beloved family member. "The difference between us," David continued, "is that you eventually figured out you could walk away from the whole system. I'm still trapped in it because I need their financial support too much to be honest about how toxic it all is." This conversation opened my eyes to the possibility that my experience wasn't as unique as I had thought. Over the next few weeks, I heard from other family members who had their own complicated relationships with the Peterson family hierarchy. Cousin Jennifer, who I had always seen as solidly middle tier in the family structure, revealed that she had been struggling with her marriage for years but couldn't discuss it honestly with the family because divorce was considered failure, and failure meant dropping down in the hierarchy toward the charity case category. Even Uncle Mark, who I had always viewed as one of the successful Peterson men, admitted that he felt constant pressure to maintain his business success because his status within the family was tied to his ability to provide jobs and financial stability for other family members. "Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I just sold everything and moved to Florida like I've always wanted to," he told me during an unexpected visit to my apartment. "But I can't, because then who would employ your mother? Who would help David when he relapses again? The whole family structure depends on me staying successful and responsible." These conversations helped me understand that the Peterson family operated like a small corporation, with everyone assigned specific roles and responsibilities based on their perceived value and reliability. Some people were management, some were reliable employees, and some were charity cases who needed to be supported and managed. But very few people were simply allowed to be family members without conditions or expectations attached to their belonging. The most surprising conversation came from Rachel herself. She appeared at my door on a cold evening in November, looking significantly less polished and confident than she had at the family reunion. Her usual perfect makeup was minimal, Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater rather than her typical carefully coordinated outfits. "Can we talk?" she asked, and something in her voice suggested that this wasn't going to be an attempt to convince me to return to the family fold. I invited her in, curious about what she could possibly want to discuss after the devastating honesty of our last interaction. "I need to apologize," she said once she was settled in my living room. Not for what I said, because it was true, but for how I said it, and for letting it build up for so many years instead of finding a way to address it honestly before it exploded like that. I waited for her to continue, not sure where this conversation was heading. "The truth is," she said, "I've been jealous of you for years." This was so far from what I expected to hear that I wasn't sure I had understood her correctly. "Jealous of me? Why?" "Because you got to be the special case," she replied. "You got extra attention, extra consideration, extra care. Do you know how exhausting it is to be the one who always has to have everything together? To be the example of Peterson family success? To never be allowed to fail or struggle or need help because that's not your role in the family." As she talked, I began to understand that the Peterson family hierarchy was oppressive at every level, not just at the bottom where I had been positioned. Rachel had been trapped by her success, just as much as I had been trapped by my neediness. She had been performing her own version of acceptability, working just as hard as I had been to maintain her position, but from the opposite direction. "I said those horrible things to you because I wanted you to know what it felt like to have your role in the family defined by other people," she continued. "But I also said them because I was angry that you got to be vulnerable and needy while I had to be strong and successful all the time." "But you could have chosen to be vulnerable," I pointed out. "You could have asked for help or support when you needed it." "Could I?" she asked. "Really? What do you think would have happened to my position in the family if I had admitted that my marriage was struggling, or that I was overwhelmed with the kids, or that I sometimes felt like I was drowning in all the expectations? Do you think they would have rallied around me with the same energy they put into managing your problems?" I thought about this question seriously, and I realized that she was probably right. The family had specific roles for each person, and stepping outside of those roles was risky regardless of which direction you moved. Rachel's value to the family was based on her success and stability. If she had revealed vulnerability or neediness, she might have found herself moving down the hierarchy rather than receiving the support she needed. "So what do you want now?" I asked. "I want to figure out how to be honest about who I actually am instead of who I'm supposed to be," she said. "And I thought maybe, since you've already figured out how to walk away from the performance, you might have some advice about how to do that." It was surreal to be asked for advice by the person who had delivered the most devastating blow to my sense of self just a few months earlier. But as we talked through the evening, I realized that Rachel and I had more in common than I had ever imagined. We had both been trapped by the Peterson family system, just from different positions within the hierarchy. The conversation didn't magically repair our relationship or erase the pain of what had happened at the reunion. But it did help me understand that the family dysfunction was much more complex and far-reaching than I had realized, and that my decision to step away from the performance had created space for other family members to question their own roles and relationships within the system. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for people is to stop enabling their dysfunctional patterns, even when that honesty feels cruel and destructive in the moment. By the spring following the reunion, I had moved into my own apartment for the first time in my life. It was a small one-bedroom place in a converted house near downtown, with hardwood floors, large windows, and enough space to set up a proper home office for my growing freelance design business. The rent was higher than I had been paying to live above Grandma Rose's garage, but it was worth it for the psychological freedom of having a space that was entirely my own. My mother had initially been worried about my decision to move out, concerned that I was burning bridges with the only financial support system we had ever known. But as she watched me build a life that was based on my own choices rather than others' expectations, she began to consider making changes in her own situation as well. "I've been thinking about looking for a different job," she told me one Saturday morning as we sat in my new kitchen drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. "I'm tired of working for Uncle Mark and having to be grateful for the opportunity. I want to work somewhere that my employment is based on my skills and experience rather than family obligation." It was a major shift for her, and I knew it represented the same kind of psychological breakthrough that I had experienced when I decided to stop performing for the Peterson family's approval. She was ready to find out who she was when she wasn't defined by their charity and managing their disappointment in her life choices. Within 2 months, she had found a position with a larger company doing similar bookkeeping and administrative work, but for significantly better pay and with colleagues who knew nothing about her personal history or family situation. The change in her demeanor was remarkable. She seemed lighter, more confident, more like the person I imagined she might have been before she became so focused on managing our position within the Peterson family hierarchy. We also began to build our own traditions that had nothing to do with the Peterson family calendar. Instead of the elaborate family reunion that had dominated our summers for over 20 years, we planned our own vacation, a long weekend in Chicago where my mother could revisit the neighborhoods where she had lived as a young woman, and I could see the city through the eyes of someone who was no longer afraid to take risks or pursue dreams that might not be practical. It was during that trip that I realized how much of my life had been spent in a state of constant preparation for other people's judgment. I had been so focused on maintaining my acceptability within the Peterson family structure that I had never developed my own sense of what I enjoyed, what I valued, or what I wanted to accomplish in life. Chicago gave me a glimpse of possibilities that I had never allowed myself to consider. The city was full of people who had created their own definitions of success and family and belonging. I met other freelance designers who had built businesses around their creativity rather than their ability to manage family expectations. I saw couples who had chosen each other based on compatibility and love rather than family approval. I encountered communities of people who had found their tribes based on shared interests and values rather than shared bloodlines. For the first time, I began to imagine what it might look like to build a life around what I actually wanted rather than what others expected of me. My freelance design business continued to grow throughout that year, fueled by my newfound freedom to take creative risks and pursue projects that genuinely interested me. Without the constant anxiety about maintaining family relationships, I had more energy to devote to building professional relationships and developing my skills. I began specializing in working with small nonprofit organizations, using my design skills to help groups that were working to make positive changes in their communities. This work was infinitely more satisfying than anything I had done when my career choices were filtered through concerns about family approval and financial security. I was good at it, I enjoyed it, and it aligned with values that I had never been able to fully express when I was focused on demonstrating my worthiness to people who had already decided that I would always be a charity case. But the most significant change was in how I approached relationships with other people. Without the constant backdrop of performing for family approval, I began to develop friendships that were based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. I joined professional organizations for designers and found mentors who were interested in helping me grow because they saw potential in my work, not because they felt obligated to manage my development. I also began to date for the first time since college, something I had never felt free to do seriously while I was so focused on managing family dynamics. The Peterson family had strong opinions about appropriate relationships, and I had always been afraid that choosing the wrong person would affect my already precarious position within their hierarchy. Now, without their approval to maintain, I was free to explore relationships based on what I actually wanted in a partner rather than what would be most likely to improve my standing with the family. It was liberating and terrifying in equal measure, but it was also honest in a way that nothing in my previous life had been. The man I eventually fell in love with was someone I met through my hiking group, a social worker named Michael who understood something about helping people without creating dependencies or power imbalances. He had grown up in his own complicated family situation and appreciated my decision to prioritize my own well-being over maintaining toxic relationships, even when those relationships provided certain benefits. The courage it takes to walk away from your entire support system because it wasn't actually supporting you, he told me one evening as we watched the sunset from a hiking trail overlook. That's not something everyone can do. Most people would rather stay trapped in dysfunction than face the uncertainty of freedom. His perspective helped me understand that what I had done wasn't just about leaving a toxic family dynamic, it was about choosing to value my own authenticity over the security that came with playing a role that others had assigned to me. It was about deciding that being genuinely myself was more important than being acceptable to people who were never going to truly accept me anyway. As I built this new life, I occasionally wondered about the Peterson family and how they were managing without their charity case to rally around and manage. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances in our small town, they had simply closed ranks and continued their annual traditions without us. There had been some initial awkwardness and discussion about what had happened, but eventually, they had settled into a new normal that didn't include my mother and me. Part of me had wondered if they would miss us, if our absence would create a void that made them reconsider their treatment of family members who didn't fit their ideal mold. But the ease with which they seemed to move on confirmed what I had suspected all along. We had been more of a burden than a blessing to them, and our departure had simplified their lives rather than diminishing them. And surprisingly, that realization brought me peace rather than pain, because it meant that my decision to leave had been the right choice for everyone involved, even if the way it happened had been traumatic and difficult. 2 years after the reunion, I received an unexpected phone call that made me realize how far-reaching the effects of my departure from the Peterson family had been. It was from my cousin Jennifer, who had been one of the family members to reach out after I left, sharing her own struggles with the family's rigid expectations about marriage and success. "I wanted you to know that Tom and I are getting divorced," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and relief. "And I wanted to thank you for showing me that it was possible to be honest about what wasn't working, even when that honesty disrupts everything." Jennifer's marriage had been struggling for years, but she had been afraid to address the problems honestly because divorce was seen as failure within the Peterson family value system. She had watched how family members who fell short of expectations were treated, like charity cases who needed to be managed rather than family members who deserve support, and she had been terrified of falling into that category. "Seeing you walk away from the whole system made me realize that I could choose my own well-being over their approval," she continued. "It's scary and difficult, but it's also honest in a way that I haven't been for years." Her call made me realize that my decision to stop participating in the Peterson family dynamics had created space for other family members to examine their own relationships with the family hierarchy. By refusing to continue playing my assigned role as the grateful charity case, I had disrupted a system that had required everyone to maintain their positions through performance rather than authenticity. Over the following months, I heard about other changes rippling through the family structure. Rachel had started seeing a therapist to work through her anxiety about maintaining her perfect family image, and she had begun setting boundaries with family members who demanded constant updates on her children's achievements and her marriage's stability. David had finally completed a successful rehabilitation program, but this time he had chosen a facility that focused on addressing underlying trauma rather than just managing addiction symptoms. He was learning to see his substance abuse as a response to family trauma rather than as a personal failing that required constant management and supervision. Even Uncle Mark had made changes, selling one of his hardware stores to reduce his stress level and financial obligations to other family members. He was learning to separate his personal worth from his ability to provide jobs and financial stability for the extended family. My mother and I were building our own version of family that was based on choice and compatibility rather than obligation and proximity. We had developed traditions that reflected our actual interests and values. Weekly coffee dates where we talked about books and dreams rather than family politics, monthly adventures to explore new places and experiences, and holiday celebrations that focused on gratitude and joy rather than obligation and performance. We had also begun to build chosen family relationships with people who appreciated us for who we actually were rather than managing us as problems to be solved. Michael had become like a son to my mother, and his easy acceptance of our complicated history had shown both of us what healthy family relationships could look like when they weren't built on hierarchies and conditional acceptance. My hiking group had evolved into a close-knit community of friends who supported each other through life's challenges without keeping score or expecting endless gratitude in return. When I had a particularly difficult month financially as I built my business, they offered help in the form of referrals and encouragement rather than charity that came with strings attached. When one of our group members went through a painful divorce, we rallied around her with practical support and emotional presence rather than judgment about her failure to maintain her marriage. These relationships taught me what I had been missing in my desperate attempts to belong to the Peterson family. Genuine care doesn't require performance or gratitude as payment. Real support doesn't come with conditions or expectations of ongoing indebtedness. True acceptance doesn't fluctuate based on your usefulness or your ability to avoid being a burden. The contrast was so stark that I began to understand why the Peterson family dynamic had felt so exhausting and unsustainable. I had been trying to earn something, love, acceptance, belonging, that can only be freely given. All of my performance and gratitude and careful management of their expectations had been beside the point because the fundamental premise of our relationship was flawed. They had positioned themselves as benefactors and me as a beneficiary, which created an inherently unequal dynamic that could never evolve into genuine family connection. I had been trying to transform charity into love through good behavior, but charity and love are fundamentally different things with different rules and different outcomes. The realization brought me a kind of peace that I had never experienced before. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently to earn their acceptance, because I finally understood that acceptance was never really on the table. They had been offering me a role in their family drama, not a place in their family structure. And once I understood the difference, I could appreciate the role for what it had been, a form of support that had genuine value, even if it wasn't what I had thought it was, without resenting them for not offering me something they were never capable of giving. 3 years after the reunion, I ran into Grandma Rose at the grocery store on a busy Saturday afternoon. I had been carefully timing my errands to avoid family members for so long that seeing her in the produce section caught me completely off guard. For a moment, we just stared at each other across a display of apples, both of us clearly uncertain about how to handle this unexpected encounter. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, and I felt a complicated rush of emotions that I hadn't anticipated. Despite everything that had happened, this was still the woman who had taught me to bake cookies, who had helped me with homework, who had been a constant presence throughout my childhood. The fact that her love had been conditional didn't erase the reality that it had also been real within its limitations. "Sarah," she said softly, and I could hear genuine emotion in her voice. "How are you, sweetheart?" The endearment hit me harder than I expected, bringing back a flood of memories from my childhood when that word had made me feel safe and loved, even if that love came with conditions I hadn't understood at the time. "I'm good, Grandma," I replied, and I realized as I said it that it was genuinely true. "I'm really good." We stood there for another moment, both of us seeming to search for the right words to bridge 3 years of separation and hurt. "I hear you started your own business," she said finally. "I'm proud of you for that." The simple statement of pride, offered without conditions or expectations, meant more to me than all of the complicated family dynamics that had defined our previous relationship. It was the first time she had ever expressed approval of something I had done without connecting it to gratitude or proper behavior, or my place within the family hierarchy. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot. I also heard that your mother found a new job and that you both seem to be doing well," she continued. "I want you to know that I think about you both often, and I hope you're happy." There was something different in her tone, something that hadn't been there during our difficult conversation 3 years earlier. She seemed to be speaking to me as a person rather than as a family problem to be managed, and the change was both subtle and profound. "We are happy," I told her. "It's been hard sometimes, but we're building something that works for us." She nodded, and I could see that she was struggling with something she wanted to say but wasn't sure how to express. "Sarah," she said finally, "I want you to know that I understand why you left. I didn't understand it at the time, but I've had 3 years to think about it, and I understand now. You were right to choose your own well-being over our expectations." The admission was so unexpected that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from anyone in the Peterson family, and it was coming from the person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. "I also want you to know," she continued, "that your leaving changed things for all of us. It made us look at how we treat people, how we define family, how we handle relationships with people who don't fit our traditional mold. Some of those changes have been difficult, but I think they've been necessary." I thought about what Jennifer had told me about her divorce, about David's new approach to recovery, about Rachel's therapy, about Uncle Mark's decision to reduce his obligations to other family members. My departure had been like pulling one thread in a tightly woven fabric. It had unraveled patterns that had seemed permanent and unchangeable. "I'm sorry that it happened the way it did," I said. I never wanted to cause problems for the family. You didn't cause problems, she replied firmly. You revealed problems that were already there. There's a difference, and I should have understood that sooner. We talked for a few more minutes about safe topics, my business, her health, changes in the neighborhood, before saying goodbye with a hug that felt different from any physical affection we had shared before. It felt like two adults who cared about each other saying goodbye, rather than a charity case expressing gratitude to a benefactor. As I drove home, I realized that the encounter had given me something I hadn't known I needed, closure that acknowledged the complexity of our relationship without trying to simplify or resolve it. Grandma Rose had validated my decision to leave while also expressing genuine care for my well-being, and she had done it without asking me to return or trying to recreate a relationship that had never really worked for either of us. It was the kind of honest, adult interaction that I had never been able to have with any Peterson family member when I was still trying to maintain my place within their hierarchy. And it showed me how much I had grown in my ability to handle complex emotions and relationships without needing them to be perfect or completely resolved. The conversation also made me realize how much my understanding of family had evolved over the past 3 years. I had gone from desperately wanting to belong to the Peterson family to angrily rejecting everything about them, to finally reaching a place where I could appreciate what they had given me while also accepting the limitations of what they were capable of offering. They had provided me with shelter, support, and a foundation during my childhood and young adulthood. That support had come with conditions and limitations that ultimately became unsustainable, but it had also been genuine within its constraints. The problem hadn't been that they were evil or deliberately cruel. The problem had been that I was trying to get something from them that they weren't equipped to provide, while they were trying to manage me in ways that ultimately weren't helpful for anyone. Understanding this didn't make me want to return to the family dynamic that had been so toxic for all of us. But it did allow me to feel genuine gratitude for what they had provided, genuine forgiveness for their limitations, and genuine peace with the choices I had made to build something different for myself. 5 years after the reunion, I found myself preparing for my own family celebration, my engagement party with Michael. As I planned the event, I was struck by how different my approach was from anything I had ever experienced within the Peterson family structure. Instead of worrying about managing complex family dynamics or ensuring that everyone felt appropriately honored according to their position in some hierarchy, I was simply focused on celebrating with people who genuinely cared about Michael and me. The guest list included my mother, Michael's family, friends from my hiking group, colleagues from my design work, and other people who had become important to us over the years. What was remarkable was how easy and natural the planning felt when it wasn't filtered through concerns about obligation and performance. I didn't have to worry about seating arrangements based on family politics or menu choices that would satisfy complicated dietary restrictions driven more by control issues than actual food needs, or gift-giving protocols that reflected complex social hierarchies. The people coming to our party were coming because they wanted to celebrate our happiness, not because they felt obligated to maintain family relationships or demonstrate their Christian charity. And we were hosting the party because we wanted to share our joy with them, not because we needed to prove our worthiness or express appropriate gratitude for their presence in our lives. The contrast with every Peterson family gathering I had ever attended was profound. This celebration would be about genuine connection and shared happiness rather than performance and social management. Michael's family had embraced both my mother and me with the kind of uncomplicated warmth that I had spent years trying to earn from the Petersons. His parents were interested in our work, our travels, our plans for the future, and our opinions about books and movies and current events. They asked questions because they were curious about us as people, not because they were evaluating our worthiness for continued inclusion in family activities. When Michael's sister offered to help with party planning, it was because she enjoyed event planning and wanted to contribute to our celebration, not because she was performing family duty or managing our inability to handle the task ourselves. When his brother volunteered to provide music for the party, it was because he was a musician who loved sharing his talent with people he cared about, not because he felt obligated to support our needs as family charity cases. The difference was subtle but transformative. Every interaction was based on choice and genuine affection rather than obligation and conditional acceptance. My mother had flourished in this environment of unconditional inclusion. She had begun sharing stories about her early life and her dreams that she had never felt free to discuss when she was constantly managing her position as the Peterson family disappointment. Michael's family was fascinated by her photography background and had encouraged her to start taking pictures again as a hobby. She had also begun dating for the first time since my father, something that would have been unthinkable when she was focused on maintaining her role as the reformed single mother who was appropriately grateful for family support. Her relationship with a widowed man she had met through her book club was healthy and age-appropriate, built on shared interests and compatible values rather than desperation or the need for approval from anyone else. Watching her blossom in relationships that didn't require her to apologize for her past or prove her worthiness showed me what I had missed by spending so many years focused on earning the Peterson family's acceptance. She was funny, intelligent, creative, and capable of genuine intimacy when she wasn't constantly performing gratitude and managing other people's disappointment in her life choices. As I planned my engagement party, I realized that I was finally living the kind of life I had always wanted but had never felt free to pursue. My design business was thriving, built around projects that excited me and clients who appreciated my work. My relationship with Michael was based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect rather than family approval or social expectations. My friendships were meaningful and reciprocal rather than strategic or obligatory. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about people and relationships. I no longer needed external validation to confirm that I was worthy of love and respect, which meant I could build relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than desperate need for acceptance. The night before the engagement party, my mother and I sat in my kitchen addressing the last of the invitations, a small task that had somehow become a moment of reflection on how far we had both come. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked, referring to the Peterson family that we rarely discussed anymore. I thought about her question seriously before answering. "I miss the idea of them," I said finally. "I miss the fantasy of belonging to a big, supportive family that celebrates each other's successes and provides unconditional love and acceptance. But I don't miss the reality of what our relationship with them actually was." "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I spent so many years trying to earn my way back into their good graces that I forgot to notice that their good graces weren't actually a place where I wanted to be." We finished the invitations in comfortable silence, both of us appreciating the peace that came with finally understanding the difference between fantasy and reality when it came to family relationships. The engagement party the next evening was everything I had hoped it would be, a genuine celebration with people who genuinely cared about us. There were no undercurrents of resentment or obligation, no carefully managed social dynamics, no performance required from anyone. Michael and I were surrounded by people who had chosen to be part of our lives and who had been chosen by us in return. It was the kind of family gathering I had always dreamed of but had never experienced, built on the foundation of authentic relationships rather than biological obligations or charitable duties. As I looked around the room at the faces of people who loved us without conditions or reservations, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along. Not acceptance into someone else's definition of family, but the ability to create my own definition based on love, respect, and genuine connection. It had taken me 30 years to understand that belonging somewhere doesn't require earning it through performance or gratitude. Real belonging happens when you find people who appreciate you for who you actually are, and when you have the courage to be that person authentically and consistently. Now, 7 years after that devastating afternoon at Grandma Rose's reunion, I can look back on Rachel's cruel words with something approaching gratitude. Not because they weren't painful, they were among the most devastating words anyone has ever spoken to me, but because they freed me from a performance that was destroying my ability to live authentically and build genuine relationships. "We only pretend to care. You're just our charity case." At the time, those words felt like they were destroying my world. Now I understand that they were actually revealing the truth about a world that had never really been mine to begin with. Rachel didn't destroy my place in the Peterson family. She showed me that I had never actually had a place there in the first place. The difference between those two realities turned out to be profound. When I thought I was losing something precious, I was devastated and desperate to repair what had been broken. When I understood that I was actually discovering the truth about something that had never been what I thought it was, I became free to build something genuine instead of trying to repair something that had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Michael and I have been married for 2 years now, and we're expecting our first child in the spring. As I prepare to become a parent myself, I often think about the kind of family environment I want to create for my child. I want them to grow up understanding that love is freely given rather than earned through performance. I want them to know that they belong in our family not because of what they accomplish or how well they behave, but simply because they are ours. Most importantly, I want them to understand the difference between healthy family relationships and toxic ones, so they never have to spend years trying to transform obligation into love through desperate performance and endless gratitude. My mother will be an amazing grandmother, free from the constraints and anxieties that defined her parenting when she was constantly managing our position within the Peterson family hierarchy. She has blossomed into the person she was always capable of being when she didn't have to apologize for her choices or prove her worthiness on a daily basis. Michael's family has embraced our growing family with the kind of enthusiasm and support that requires no performance or gratitude in return. They are excited about becoming grandparents and aunts and uncles because they love us, not because they feel obligated to include us in their family structure. Occasionally, I hear news about the Peterson family through mutual acquaintances in our small town. They continue to gather for their annual reunion, although I'm told the dynamics have shifted significantly since several family members began prioritizing their own well-being over maintaining their assigned roles in the family hierarchy. Rachel apparently went through a difficult period of therapy and self-examination after our confrontation, and she has become more honest about her own struggles with perfectionism and family expectations. David completed his recovery program and has been sober for over 3 years, building a life based on his own values rather than family approval. Jennifer successfully navigated her divorce and has found happiness in a new relationship that doesn't require family validation. Even Uncle Mark stepped back from his role as family patriarch and financial support system, discovering interests and dreams that had been suppressed by decades of obligation to maintain everyone else's stability. These changes suggest that my departure from the family system had effects far beyond my own liberation. By refusing to continue playing my assigned role, I had disrupted a dynamic that had been constraining everyone involved, even those who appeared to benefit from their positions at the top of the hierarchy. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling their toxic patterns, even when that creates short-term pain and disruption for everyone involved. I don't have any contact with the Peterson family anymore, and I don't anticipate that changing in the future. Not because I harbor resentment or anger toward them, but because we have all moved on to build healthier relationships that better serve our actual needs rather than our inherited obligations. This isn't a story about forgiveness or reconciliation, because sometimes the healthiest outcome is simply moving forward separately rather than trying to repair something that was never quite right to begin with. It's a story about the courage to value your own authentic happiness over other people's comfort with familiar dysfunction. It's about learning to recognize the difference between genuine love and conditional acceptance. It's about understanding that sometimes the most profound act of self-respect is walking away from people who can't or won't see your value. Most importantly, it's about discovering that you don't need to earn love from people who were never really capable of giving it to you. There are people in this world who will appreciate you for exactly who you are, without conditions or performance requirements or endless gratitude. But you'll never find those people if you're spending all your energy trying to transform obligation into affection with people who have already decided that obligation is all they're willing to offer. When family secrets exploded at our annual reunion that warm July afternoon, my cousin's cruel words shattered every illusion I had about belonging. Sometimes the people closest to you deliver the most devastating truths. But sometimes those devastating truths are exactly what you need to hear to finally start living authentically. 7 years later, I can honestly say that Rachel's brutal honesty was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because it felt good, it felt terrible, but because it forced me to stop performing for love that was never really available and start building a life based on genuine connection and authentic relationships. That life turned out to be everything I had been searching for all along. I just had to stop looking for it in all the wrong places.